Well, on behalf of the Royal Historical Society of Queensland, could I extend a very warm welcome to you all. We're here today with our President, Dr. Denver Beanland, who's here, and with a number of councillors who are here to welcome you to this very special building, Queensland's most precious, oldest and most precious occupied building. And a special welcome, of course, to this lecture today. As a courtesy to our speaker and to our audience, would you mind us putting your mobile phones onto silent, if that's convenient and practical? And it's a delight to be your chair today. My name's John Pern. I'm a councillor of the Historical Society here and a personal friend and professional colleague of Dr. Mick Davis, who's our speaker today. Dr. Davis is a senior ambulance paramedic. He was the Assistant Commissioner for Queensland Ambulance Service for many years in Queensland and has seen service in Bundaberg and Rockhampton and many other places in the state. Mick is many other things. He was the founder of the Kenneth James McPherson Foundation, the professional and research foundation for the Queensland Ambulance Service, which has provided many, many hundreds of thousands of dollars now for our colleagues in the ambulance service to undergo further research into paramedic studies. Mick's also worn many other hats. He was the Queensland President of the Order of Australia Association. He was the National President of the Institute of Ambulance Officers of Australia, renamed the Australian College of Paramedicine. Since that time, he was honoured with a doctorate of the University of Central Queensland University for his leadership and service to pre-hospital care in Queensland. But today, Dr. Davis is here to tell us about the last 130 years of the Queensland Ambulance Service, one of the, as we all know, one of the best services anywhere in Queensland. The response time from call to scoop, as they say, is 9.5 minutes in metropolitan centres in Queensland, the best in international best practice up there with the very best. And Mick has been at the centre of that throughout his professional lifetime. He's a professional historian and is the curator and founder of the Queensland Ambulance Service Museum at Wynnum, and he's also the curator of the regional Queensland Ambulance Service museums in Queensland at Barcaldine, at Highfields, at Roma and Charters Towers, as well as the major centre in Wynnum in Brisbane, to which he extends a very warm welcome for anybody to visit at any time. So without further ado, Dr. Mick Davis, who'll tell us about 130 years of the Queensland Ambulance Service.
Thank you all, good afternoon. I'm here today to give something back to you because you very generously, the Society gave me one of your centenary medals. So thank you very much for that. And the story I'm going to tell you is it's a great story of service to the communities. It'll be 130 years of that service in September this year. It's not far away. The opening slide is the one I'll come back to at the last, is the 50-year point, and this is Mackay or Mackay, depending on whether you live in Rockhampton or Mackay. So I've got to get that going. There it is. So why do we look at our history? You all know this very well. The past can and should inform the future. One of the best industries in looking at what happened and trying to make sure it doesn't happen again is the airline industry. We're in a patient care industry, so we need to look at the past. We need to learn from the past because we deal with people. That's one of the key points of the evolution of the ambulance service over time. And if we didn't do that, we'd still be doing resuscitation in this way. Does anyone know what that's called? The old Schaefer's method? And because of looking at the past and learning from it, we now have much better resuscitation methods. And that's a benefit to all of us. And I'm in the statistically significant age group, And I think we need to look at good patient care. Say that with your teeth out. Statistically significant age group. Oops, I've gone backwards again. A founder is attributed to this man, Seymour Warren, S-E-Y-M-O-R-E, not S-E-E-M-O-R-E. Seymour was a military medic in Queensland, and you know this story better than I do, had a colonial military presence, and they had volunteer medical military people. And they used to do a lot of things in the community, teach first aid as well as doing their own military medical drills. The Echo used to have horse racing. In 1892, a fellow named Elchin in the maiden handicap fell off his horse and fractured his leg. Good Samaritans picked him up and took him in a molly-brown cab, a four-wheeled horse-drawn cab, to 300 metres or so into the Royal Brisbane Hospital. In doing so, they made his simple fracture compound. That means it's either got a wound leading to the fracture or it's got a bone protruding. But the rough handling horrified young, and he's only a young man, early 20s, Warren, and he was sitting there with the medical director of medical superintendent of the Royal Brisbane Hospital, and they said, this isn't good enough. We've got to have a civil ambulance service. And in the 12th of September 1892, Warren and his colleagues from the military medics and a few other people, Dr. Booth and others, had a meeting at Warren's home in Annerley, and they formed the City Ambulance Transport Brigade. Their original quarters was in the Courier Mail, and they were very largely involved in the floods of 1893. And they had floods outside their own door at the Courier Mail building, which is in Queen and Edward, or Queen and Albert, one of those two. You people might know the answer to that. The artist's name is very appropriate for this sort of work. This is a first case from Taringa to New Farm, to a medical centre down there, and it was hand carried. It's October 1892. You've got Serge Tunic on. How are you going? You okay? You're not hot? Carrying all right? How many kilometres? Getting on for 8 or 9 maybe? You got any water with you? You might have a canvas-covered military medical flask or water flask. They've got safety things there. They said the shoulder straps to help them with the weight. Army stretcher. Lady with the umbrella who very quickly became redundant. And that's the way it was. Do you think the patient would be scared? You're on the stretcher, you weigh about 80 kilos. How are you going? You okay? You're not frightened? The truth of it is that she's probably grateful somebody came for her, that somebody's looking after her. So already the lady with the umbrella is redundant. We've now got an Ashford litter built in Brisbane here, got a canopy over it. The guys are doing drills. Some famous Brisbane names there you'll know, up on the screen. And these people were your original ambulance crew from Brisbane. They're volunteers, sometimes they get paid. The doctor might pay them or somebody would pay them to pick up a patient, but all donations, donation driven. Stevens there is a fellow with the beard, became the superintendent of Brisbane eventually, and Warren went on his way and started services in Wollongong and Newcastle and in Sydney and in Auckland. And then he came back to Australia and became a station master and finished his life on the railway. His relatives still live out at Injune. I was going to tell you about the litter. Has got a U-shaped axle under it, and the purpose for that is to carry the stretcher through and step over the axle and drop it into the frame. Now, if they didn't have that U-shape, you would have to try and do this sort of thing with the weight of the stretcher. So a great bit of engineering in a very early time. The greatest myth in the Queensland Ambulance is that the women came in the 70s. In this photo we have Mary Goulet, who's the second female employee in uniform, in the middle in the front there. And she was a bearer collector, which meant she had to do first aid and attend to patients as well as go around and collect money. And she was a uniformed person. Ladies, how would you be? The scissors skirt on her? Very hot. Be warm to wear. Had to wear your hat. You weren't allowed to go without your hat. Very important. But Mary was our second employee. The first one was employed in 1895, and we cannot find her name because most of the records say the staff was 3 bearers and a collector, and the officers of the service were called bearers in those days. A little checklist here. We've got the ambulance service beginning in Brisbane in 1892, and already by 1895, and primarily because of their work in the 1893 floods, they have a subsidy from government. The government had seen the value of the service after 2 years, which is pretty remarkable, 3 years. They also created the Parent Committee as a statutory body to protect them under law, and you probably know, most of you, that that means that the entity is treated as an individual under law. The ambulance service extended beyond Brisbane. That took 8 years. The logical one, and the first one, was Ipswich. And Warren and his colleagues at Usage Jack and those sort of people used to go out there and render and teach first aid and do little first aid jobs out there. But the illogical one was Charters Towers. Anybody think of a reason? Gold. They had money. They convinced the Brisbane people that they had the money to employ staff and buy equipment. And because Charters Towers was getting an ambulance service, Townsville couldn't be left out, so they wanted one too. But they're a little bit slow because Charters Towers beat them by a couple of months. Ambulance service extended beyond Brisbane. The Queensland transitioned from a colony to a state, and suddenly this City Ambulance Transport Brigade name was of no more use, and they formed the Queensland Ambulance Transport Brigade. When I was a boy, QATB could mean quick attention to blondes or quick Italian bandages, as well as QATB, Queensland Ambulance Transport Brigade, but we didn't lose that military brigade word, and we didn't lose some of the military paraphernalia that is on our uniforms. The first motor vehicle came along, we'll talk about that later. 2 World Wars, where were the men? Who was looking after the service? Yeah, older men and fit women. Any woman who wasn't working, and she might have been working on some sort of war effort and volunteering for the ambulance as well. That's the way it was. Two-way radios come into being. 3 000 calls took forever. First mooted in 1936 and finally come in the 60s. The Ambulance Service Act changed. Up until 1967, they were under the Hospital Act for years. And some of the old buildings like Ipswich and that would see QATBH, Queensland Ambulance Transport Brigade Hospital. And the other things, superannuation, which I'm a beneficiary of, came into being in the 69, and the ambulance training school finally got going in the 70s. This is Toowoomba in 1902, and Toowoomba's always been a rich city. They've got quite a bit of equipment here. They've got white ponies. No logical reason for white other than it's a clinical colour. Could have bought black, brown or brindle. They had some dapple greys. They didn't have many blacks and brown horses, but they had lots of white ones. And you can see they've all got a first response vehicle, the sulky, called a jingle with the backward facing seat, to pull the sulky along. Now there's 3 people on it, and the reason for that is the driver would drop the 2 off to wheel the litter back. But the sulky was all about not getting exhausted, taking the litter out to the patient. If you're pushing a litter in a hot tunic on an October or a November day in Brisbane, how would you be? You'd be right. You've got to get out there, you've got to treat the patient, then you've got to wheel it back again wherever. And to do that, sometimes they go on the trains and put the litter on the trains, because the railway would let them ride their trains around the Brisbane city. But you can see the centre there looks like a bit of a stable. That's because these people were multi-skilled before that term came into being. And they would look after the horses, look after the garden, look after their station, look after their patients and all their equipment. So along came the motor vehicle. Now motor vehicles have been around since 1870, so we've got 1908, we've got ourselves a French Clement Talbot. One of the Brisbane Committee people had a car and thought we should get a car. This is not a patient-carrying ambulance. This is the same function as the horse and sulky. It's a rapid response vehicle. Take the litter out, drop the 2 off, and bring the car back and take a litter somewhere else. Why is it a French Clement Talbot? Brisbane had a firm called the Canadian Motor and Cycle Company, who had French connections. So getting a car onto a boat, in 1908, is quite a feat. Where was all the demand? In the Northern Hemisphere, where the cars were made. So you want a car in Brisbane, you what? And they had a French connection, that's why it was a French Clement Talbot. Does anyone see Gallipoli, the movie? The ambulance in that is in Williamtown in the Victorian Ambulance Service. It's a 1916 Talbot, and it was in that movie. The lights are kerosene, the wheels are solid rubber, and if you're a patient there, you'd think the thing had square wheels. Be rough. The feature of Queensland Ambulance is one that the community owns it and still perceives that it owns that service. I mean, when they changed from the QATV to QAS, they closed down all of the local administrative ambulance committees. But in their wisdom, they kept them on as local ambulance committees. Why? Because every one of these committees in their history had started the ambulance service in their community. They'd raised the money, they had donations or everything else, and this Gordon Vale place still exists, it's still there, the building. It's a wonderful example, the finest Queensland timber, built by local labour, probably all donated, the labour and the timber. The car, the guy's uniform, and everything else donated, or coming out of community money. No one can hear my phone, can it? It's coming through my hearing aids. Now, ladies, this was a male-dominated job, so if you weren't prepared to volunteer for the ambulance, your husband wouldn't get a superintendent's role. But the bad news is, because of that, the phones were in the kitchen, the bathroom, the bedroom, and everywhere else. And if he was away, in Gordon Vale, to go 18 miles might take him 5 hours, in the way the roads were in those days. So you were, unless there was an honorary officer there, you would have to treat someone to come in with cut with a machete from cutting cane or anything like that, or bitten by a snake that might come in the door, and you had to deal with it. And you had the 3 kids upstairs, and that was the life of a lot of wives of superintendents in the ambulance service. They weren't all QATV vehicles. This is a Fiat in Maryborough. Maryborough was a bit of a rebel state. It wanted to be the MATB, the Maryborough Ambulance Transport Brigade. They did their own thing and eventually got taken over by the hospital board. In 1992 in Bundaberg's district super, I brought them into the Queensland Ambulance and somebody else brought Longreach in, and the hospital ambulance became assimilated with the ambulance in the 1992 when they formed the Queensland Ambulance Service. But this one's a Fiat. Don't think that's a long motor vehicle, it's not. Probably the patient came right up beside the driver. And again, you've got the solid rubber wheels, so it's probably a bit rough to ride in for a patient. How'd you be with champagne for a bee sting? You be okay? Strychnine for snakebite? Brandy for a sedative? You be all right? You happy? Would you nick a nip of brandy if you had some in your kit? You're the officer of the day, you're feeling a bit down. You wouldn't go nick a nip of brandy, would you? No, never. There was no science behind it. Doctors used to carry brandy as a sedative. It was just the way it was. People were hearing things from, you'd hear something from someone else, this is good. A lot of the ambulance medical practice came from military medics in the army. And we still had good nurses and doctors providing lectures for the ambulance service. John had been a provider of lecture service to the ambulance over the years. But in those early days, there was a lot of, just hand-me-down talks. And my mum, if one of us got the measles, all went into bed together, she didn't want 6 weeks of one after the other getting measles. So somebody told, that's the way it was, and that's the way people did things. And this was in the typical officer's kit of the day. Some instruments, hospital blanket, John, we all had hospital blankets. You'd leave one and get one. So that's probably got the Queensland Health somewhere on that blanket. The survivor in there is this. The bag mask resuscitator. Wonderful tactile equipment. You can feel the resistance. You can inflate the patient, particularly child, and feel the resistance and not hyperinflate, as they say. Because if you hyperinflate, the air goes into the stomach, next thing you've got regurgitation, you've got an airway that's contaminated. They're very important, and that survived. It's a different form now, but it's the same principle. Do these people look happy? Used to carry things for bogs. They probably had a few jacks and a few things in there. Farquhar McLeod on the right is the Deputy Superintendent of Rockhampton. Lost his son in their ambulance crash in the 50s. These photos are wonderful. They tell us all about the cars, the uniforms, the accoutrements, all sorts of things. Now, I'm going to ask you, who the hell out of Canberra at Westwood, 50 mile west of Rocky, in 1930? Cameras in those days weren't box brownies, they hadn't come along yet. They were boxes on tripods mostly. Did the patient take the photo? Where is the patient? Are they coming or going? How long have they been on the road? Would you be frustrated? They might have been bogged 8 to 10 times or more from rocky. The go-go range wasn't bitumen in those days, and I've been on it many times. Are they happy? They did what people knew what they knew. They did what they could do. This is later in the 80s, so we weren't free of it. The roads weren't wonderful. This is Winton. There's a great story behind this one where the fellow who got this car took it home, put a gurney on it, and took all the sun writing off it. And the local copper said to him, "Why didn't you leave it a day or so? It would have all fallen off and you just would have had to hose it." But the life of an ambler, even now, we say to the young people, you will get bogged. It'll be on a beach or on a farm. It'll be after a storm somewhere where you're off the road, but you will get bogged. It's part of life. I managed to knock down a letterbox with a guide in a storm one night. He said, come back. He said, we flatten the letterbox. So to get around these problems, I had these sort of vehicles. There's about 15 of these still around. Anyone been to Atherton and seen the bus up there, the ambulance bus? In Cloncurry, there's a Ford with a bogie under it, a Ford vehicle, like a motor vehicle, and lots of these quads. The thing that we learned from history here, if you see it on the football on Friday nights, is the configuration. We've still got the 2 seats and the stretcher beside it. Must have worked. My memory with these things is sitting at the Dawson River, getting eaten alive by mosquitoes and midges, waiting for this little light coming towards me and getting a lady who's pregnant or something like that from during her ambulance, because the Dawson River would be well and truly over the road. The other way to get around it was aeroplanes, which is so logical. Aeroplanes have been with Queensland Ambulance since aeroplanes have been in Australia, and the first provider of ambulance services air services to Queensland Ambulance was Qantas, who had quite a service in an old DH-50A aeroplane, and they would put the patients down through the fuselage behind the pilot. And if you think that's hot and sweaty, okay, take your ambulance on the road and be 9 hours getting bogged and maybe not getting in on time and dying. So it's logical. Just the aeroplane was such a wonderful piece of equipment to come into the Queensland Ambulance. Most of this work done between centres by flying doctor now, and the emergency stuff by helicopter. So the air ambulance has never left us. This is Brisbane. Radios first came into Queensland Ambulance at Blackall of all places by Jack Stibbs, who was a superintendent out there, and the PMG was auctioning radios from the spotters on the Cape during the war, and they were up there to watch for Japanese aircraft coming into Australia. And Stibbs thought he could talk to his property, so he got a HF radio or two, and Cairns Air Ambulance and got some, and eventually they got them between the cars and the roads. And this is the Brisbane control room of those days. Another little list here. Analgesic took a long time. We had a thing called Trilene, which had to convince the patient that it worked, because it didn't, and it smelled like dry cleaning fluid. It was awful stuff. And we eventually got this mixture of oxygen and nitrous oxide called Antonox. And nitrous oxide, you know, is the maternity gas or laughing gas. And people in our service used to pinch it to put in saloon cars. It made them go faster. The biggest change in 1986 came with the change of the state board, the state council it's called, of 24 members who could not agree on anything, down to a board of 12, and suddenly things started to change. And they changed quickly from there. And that was the use of things like a coronary care program was introduced, specialised care, a specification of statewide computerisation. Myself, as the only person with a degree in those days in the ambulance, went to Brisbane to write those specs for the state computerisation. This use of TSN 11 satellite thing for our training and broadcasting, and we would go to the hospital, the people in the field would go to the hospital where there was a dish, and they would watch the video and then ring in with their questions. The other things there, the ambulance moved from health to emergency services. That wasn't really good because it had bureaucrats overseeing a commissioner of ambulance who had no patient focus, no understanding of patient focus. And that lasted for quite a while. We went on to other things. We had a major restructure in 1991 from the QATB to the Queensland Ambulance Service. And they absorbed the the committee-run ambulance services into districts and regions under a commissioner and assistant commissioners. The associate diploma was introduced as a first accredited training. The first pass-fail training was a coronary care course. The union was very resistant to pass-fail concepts. The reason? They thought people would lose their jobs. And we thought it was so important because we wanted to know that people were competent. And the way we got around it, Keith Mount was a medical director with myself as chief of training at the time. We would write back to a QATB committee and say this person should not be in unsupervised patient contact. As a way we'd get around people who weren't making the grade. And the union were comfortable, but they had no choice. It was a public safety issue. Other things there, the establishment of local ambulance committees has changed in 1991 with the old QATB committees. A lot of people of whom continue to give their service on the local ambulance committee and are still there today. Other things there, emergency service legislation undermined the power of the Queensland Ambulance Service Commissioner and gave the powers to a Director General. And I've got to say, I wish that Director General would have seen the ceiling of a few ambulances. He might have been a bit more considerate. Other things there, Commissioner reporting to the Director General, introduction of community ambulance cover. Do you remember paying a levy on your electricity bill? Do you remember paying a subscription before that? Do you ever pay a bill because you weren't a subscriber? Nobody. You're all good people. The other things, this is the Antonox setup. You see the length of the tube. The demand valve is down at the bottom of the cylinder, and the patient's got to have a fair sort of respiratory effort to inhale that drug. And you couldn't give it to anyone with chest injuries because it's stifled breathing, this drug. And you couldn't give it to anyone who's intoxicated because as bad as meth, they'd get very violent. But for a child to suck that drug up that tube, just almost impossible. The respiratory effort was quite large to do that. This is our first training school people, the group here. There was a group that went to New South Wales and had a look at theirs, and then they ran the first ones, and the superintendents of the QATB centres all sent themselves to training so they could see what it was like. So the people who needed it most, those in patient contact, didn't get to go until a couple of years after this. But then we went very quickly into the 80s where we had regional and localised training. This is the first of a specialised set of ambulances. The helicopters do this work now. This is a neonatal retrieval ambulance that operated out of Brisbane. It took about 150 k's up to Toowoomba, down to Coffs Harbour and up to Nambour, those sort of areas. And it'd be staffed by a neonatal nurse and paramedics and sometimes a neonatal doctor as well. And that's all done by aeroplane now, that work. We went to these regions based in those places. We had a assistant commissioner in each of the places, and we had rationalised the communication centres. Each of these ambulance services had a control room, as they called it. And they didn't like the officers treating or working in a committee's area because the money they raised in their area they thought should go into the patients of their area and the people of their area. So that sort of thing was changed with the conversion to the Queensland Ambulance Service. The number one rule was the closest ambulance can respond. And a Wynnum ambulance was at the Prince Charles Hospital. A cardiac arrest at Strathpine was sent, and the car was from Wynnum. So that's how it was working, and that's how it should have worked. You never get your lunch, but that's how it should have worked. So there's 7 regions. We introduced a emergency medical system, which we'll talk about. Higher education came in, and we managed our history from 1992 when our centenary took place. We thought we should do something about this history of the ambulance. It's a good story and a good history. Free pensioners was the other one. Peter Beattie got a bright idea that pensioners should have free ambulance. The downside of that was they were our best payers, best subscribers. So suddenly the ambulance were struggling for funds. So they had to do something, hence the community cover thing and all that. What happened there? This is a challenge. This is the size of Queensland compared to the rest of Australia. How do we get to now 288 ambulance stations? We had 98 in 1991. The population is growing quickly, and the challenge is to provide an ambulance service. So we do it by road, air and sea. We cover a lot of ground. In that same area there of Australia, we've got 7 ambulance services, and there's probably 30 or 40 ambulance services in this area here. The emergency medical system introduced only came into being because of the combination of ambulance service from these old QATB committees. So the simple principles are get the best care to a patient wherever that patient is, upgrade the care, and the second principle is retrieve them by the best means to the best place. This is why we teach first aid in the Queensland Ambulance. Getting the best care to the patient might be you doing CPR while the ambulance is coming. And I'm hoping that you're all up to date because I'm in that age group. So the most common person to find a kid in a pool is the person who owns a property. So anybody who owns a pool should have their CPR up to date. I've seen too much of it, honestly. It's not nice to see a kiddie who can't breathe. So the second principle is retrieve them by the best place on a farm with a broken leg up where all the scrubbers are in the hills. You've got to get them down to wherever the ambulance is or wherever the helicopter's coming into. That might mean a quad, might mean some very rough rides down the farm. That's the sort of principle. So you retrieve them in Queensland. Most things go east because that's where the major hospitals are. And if they're going burns or they're burns or other things, will come south to the spinal will come south to the Brisbane hospitals. So that's the sort of normal track. Our best experience with this is one of our own who fell off a ship 16 metres out of a helicopter onto a ship in Cape York at 4 in the afternoon. It's a couple of hours down to Cairns by helicopter. So the Thursday Island helicopter come out and retrieved him. He was quadriplegic and he was in the spinal unit of PA at 10 o'clock that night. Which is pretty good. And you saw the distance on the map there, that, you know, the Cape York is further away than the Southern Ocean. Some other things, the associate diploma quickly went to a graduating class of intensive care paramedics, a diploma, and then some postgraduates and finally registered practitioner, which is today's standard. These are the sort of things that happen clinically. A lot of people think of the ambulance as motorised. It's very much clinically as well. And we've got all of these sorts of changes, clinical audits, a medical director, a medical advisory committee, and now the intensive care paramedics are on the helicopters. They call them critical care paramedics these days, and things like a high acuity response and a low acuity response. So there's some of the clinical developments. Looking after our history, this is Charters Towers Museum where the motorbike is, the Winter Museum here, the red one, and this is Rocky, how they used to treat people and carry them on a wool cart of all things when money was tight. And the opening of the Wynnum Ambulance in 1927. A lot of our patients are elderly, so our key word is respect. And when I do this sort of talk to the new graduates, respect is woven through that presentation. The great thing about being 20 is you don't see yourself as being 70 or 80. You'd never see yourself as needing someone else looking after you and your independence in the care of somebody else. And this is why we stress the need for respect. The livery change, we had firstly yellow, what we call baby shit yellow in the old days. It was good colour because you could go to the races, clean the chrome, leave the car dirty and you can nick off and it looked all right. Clean the glass and the chrome, but nowadays the white ones you had to clean them properly. The blue bonnets were about the distance we drove and the glare. If you're driving 100 more Ks when a white bonnet in front of you, it gets very glary and you can get a headache from that. So we went to blue bonnets for a while. Now all the modern cars have got such a sharp bonnet that's no longer a problem. The new livery you're fairly familiar with is one down the bottom here today. 2012 we went back to Queensland Health, and that was one of the better things because we went back as a more senior partner in Queensland Health. Originally back before the 80s, it would take 5 years to get a building, to get approval and go through that process. We come back, we've got our own staff and we have a direct line to the Director General through the Commissioner. And we have our own resources and our own finance teams and clinical teams. We have pharmacists and we have mental health professionals and all those sort of things in the team these days. We do maintain a direct alignment with health through our districts. All of our districts are right aligned with health districts. That's important because 95% of our work is with our health. In emergency services, we do about 5% of our work with fire and with police and that sort of thing. They're there all the time, but every day after every incident, we're dealing with a health facility of some sort. So the sort of things that have changed today, the analgesia of choice is fentanyl, and some people like to steal that, so we've got an audit program on the drugs. and they microscopically examine these little ampules and for interference, all sorts of things. Now that's a repertoire, and it's quite good for you and for me, for patients, that this is available on the spot when the ambulance gets here. We have an equal opportunity service. We have a gender balance service. About gender balance, females like this job, so it's nearly 55 to 45 in favour of the females at the moment. And in my earlier days, the old fellas used to say, oh, bloody females don't come here, they can't lift the stress, they won't be able to do this job. It's their brain, not their brawn. And that's the difference. And they're very, very good. If you've got a female officer, you're in good hands. You've got a male officer, you're in good hands. The other things there is being a paramedic with QS now offers you a career path in different things. You can be a paramedic practitioner in the bush, or you can be a high acuity officer in any of the urban areas. You can work on a helicopter, you can work on the road, you can work on the sea. And you can go into training, and that's the best one because in training you can influence the care of a lot. If you're on a road officer on the road, you can influence the care of the patients in front of you. If you're in education, you can influence the care of whatever those officers are going out to eventually treat. Typical officer now are both genders, and they're well educated and skilled, and we hope respectful. And we trust they are respectful. Mackay at 50-year point, these are telephone wires, not electricity. This is the road past the station. The car is 12 years old, and the reason for that in 1942 was the war was on and all the effort was going into war manufacturing. The other things there are the tunics, which were still in point. The horse and sulky had gone, the litter had gone. The people in the civilian uniforms are probably the Mackay QATB committee, and this is their 50-year celebration in 1942. And don't you love the road and the grass? And anyone knows Mackay, there'll be snakes in that bloody grass. If you go over near the water, there will be crocodiles. Thank you very much.